everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Season 6 officially starts tonight, and I thought it would be both fun and horrifying to head out into the abyss that are our oceans, lakes, rivers. What might we encounter out there, away from land or anchored to it? What will you see? I've never traveled through a real cave, let alone an underwater one. Sounds terrifying. Tonight, we meet someone who has, and can confirm, terrifying. My friends, when it comes to things in the open water, varying levels of isolation, there's plenty of things to be afraid of. The list is practically endless, and we're about to dive into just a few right now. So, let's get started, shall we? Last year, my mate Danny and I took his speedboat out for a little ocean fishing. About 4 nautical miles east of harbor, we stopped the boat and cast out from opposite sides of the deck. Minutes later, Danny sets down his rod and rushes to the front of the boat. He grabs a pair of binoculars and looks back in the direction he's facing. I turn around and immediately see what he sees. From a distance, it looks like 2 men were sitting on a vessel that recently capsized. The keel floating above the waves, just enough for the men to sit on it to avoid the cold. Danny sets down the binoculars and throttles the boat to life. We start heading towards the distressed men. We cut the engine short of their overturned vessel to slow our approach as to not splash them with our waves. As our drift brought us closer, the shape of the men's features began to take form. My heart started to palpitate, noticing how similar their features resembled me and Danny. Danny walks to stand next to me when he sees what I see. We're both in disbelief, but the adrenaline of the situation prolonged our comprehension. Danny turns around to grab life jackets. I run to grab the life preserver. But when we meet back at portside, there's no longer anyone on the overturned boat. The keel was empty of its passengers, clinging to its wood, like they'd never been there. There was no sign of them anywhere. The capsized boat didn't disappear, but we watched it slowly continue to sink, until finally it was fully submerged. We watched it sink into the darkness. We waited for any remains of the wreckage to float up, so we could identify and report it when we got back to shore, but nothing surfaced. Released oxygen bubbles didn't even float up after the boat sank. We were in a stunned silence. I made a comment about us just meeting a couple of ghosts, but Danny commented on their features, saying ghosts don't mimic. Whatever it was, we agreed it wasn't earthly, and it definitely wasn't good. An undoubtedly bad sign, so we decided to cut our fishing trip short and head back. On the way back, I was on the verge of tears without having any idea as to why, but I vividly remember feeling an overwhelming grip of sadness when we saw the men. A feeling I initially ignored because I thought that we had to rescue some stranded fishermen. And this feeling followed me all the way home. The air only truly felt clean the next day. It was like my energy was completely expended. Emotionally exhausted from a leisure trip. If you consider this paranormal, it was my only experience with otherworldly entities. Do spirits wander the ocean? Why did they look like us? I don't know if I believe in all the devil stuff, but I really can't classify all of this in another category. Any logical explanations? When I was about 12, I got the opportunity to stay with my friend and her family who lived on a boat. They traveled to many locations on the boat for many years, but this story, we were in Jamaica for a week. The mini vacation started off so fun. We were in the pool or at the beach back and forth every day, all day. But on the third day, I started seeing enormous snakes in the water, just looking at me, blinking with their big eyes. I remember I was stepping over into the boat. I could see a huge snake diving down into the water. It creeped me out. I couldn't sleep and I didn't want to go swimming in the ocean anymore. The family took notice that I didn't want to go into the ocean, so they decided that maybe a river would be fun. I remember on the journey I was contemplating in my mind if it would be safe or not. When I got to the river and looked around, I didn't see any snakes, so I was ecstatic. I started stripping down to my swimsuit, ran right into the river, swam across to a cliff, climbed up the cliff, getting ready to dive off. But when I looked down, there was a snake staring at me, blinking. I touched a guy and a girl beside me and I said, "Do you see that?" The guy said, "What?" and just jumped in the river. The girl looked at me and said, Yes, I see it," with a scared tone to her voice. I looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going crazy, so I said, "What exactly do you see?" And she said, "The big snake." I looked at her in such shock, but I also had a sense of relief. We were stuck at the top of the cliff. People came and just jumped off, but every time we looked down, we regretted that we looked. I don't know what would have happened if I jumped off like those other people, but I wasn't brave enough to test it. So I did what I thought was best for both of us. I cried. I cried in fear, and my friend's dad came for me and the other girl. I remember asking the girl if this was the first time she'd seen them, the snakes. I remember her saying no, she sees them all the time. Coming back from that trip, I never saw the snake again, but I still wonder what was the reason for them. Why was it just us who could see them? Any theories, anyone? My favorite things to do have always been swimming and exploring, so it's no wonder that I became obsessed with scuba diving and caving. I was 12 when my dad started taking me to do these things, but I didn't go into my first underwater cave until I was 18. After that, I went to as many as I could, as often as I could go. I had no problem exploring the same one over and over. There are some close to where I grew up, and I know them as well as my own home. I'm 36 now, and in all those years, I've never had any close calls or seen anything unusual until my trip to Hawaii. You can see many of their underwater caves on Google, but you won't find the one that I'm talking about. And I'd rather not say exactly where it is, so don't ask. I don't want to be responsible for someone else going down there when I barely made it out. A few days into my trip, I met some locals who told me about a spot that I wouldn't find on the maps. They were planning to go that weekend, were kind enough to invite me to go along. Unfortunately, I was too excited to wait. They warned me not to go alone, but I knew I could find it based on their description. I only intended to explore the entrance. I was never planning to take any risks. I even left most of my equipment behind so I wouldn't be tempted. But this cave was unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not uncommon to find air pockets in these types of places. But that's usually what they are, pockets. Smaller spaces where the water doesn't reach the cave's roof. If you're lucky, there will be a ledge or somewhere to rest without having to use your oxygen supply. But, barring a few exceptions, that's about it. This cave was the mother of all exceptions. I swam to the other end and found that what I thought would be a good resting ledge, but it wasn't. Once I got out of the water, I saw the ledge actually went further than my flashlight could reach. I kept walking, thinking each step would suddenly reveal the end, but it never came. I don't know how long it actually took, but I walked much further than intended. When I finally reached the other side, there was no wall, just more water. I immediately wanted to jump in and keep exploring, but I suddenly got a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The coldest chills of my life spread through my body. I've had friends get creeped out like that sometimes. It just never happened to me. But whatever this was, I could feel it in my bones. I carefully surveyed my surroundings while trying to calm down. That's when I noticed another ledge across the water. After a short debate with my better judgment, I decided it was safe enough to swim across and continue exploring the other side. That's when I heard footsteps. My stomach traded places with my heart. It sounded like something very large was dragging its feet and getting closer. But when I shined my light in that direction, the sound stopped. That's when the real fear hit me. If something else was down there, trying to sneak up on me, they only had bad intentions. Knowing I had to leave quickly, I kept my light trained on the opposite ledge in hopes of gaining a little extra distance as I backed away, and a huge pair of red eyes appeared. They were only visible for a brief second before fading back into the darkness, but they definitely weren't human. Even if they hadn't been red and glowing, no one has eyes that big or that far apart. Whatever they belonged to was massive, and I didn't want to meet it. Eventually, my light fell short of the opposite ledge, and a loud splash came immediately after. That thing had jumped into the water to continue its pursuit, and I panicked. I turned and began running as a deafening roar erupted behind me. It made no other sound as it swam across, but it arrived at the other side faster than any human could have. Next, I heard its claws tearing into the rock wall as it climbed onto the ledge, and I fully believed I was going to die there. As the sound of its pursuing footsteps grew closer with each second, I was tempted to turn and face the beast before it killed me. If I was going to die, I deserved to know what my killer looked like, but I was too afraid. Another low growl echoed the cave. Tears filled my vision. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the end just ahead, and somehow I'd made it. I barely had enough self-control to enter the water properly, but I'd been through too much to let stupid mistakes kill me now. I swam like a madman, fully expecting a large splash to follow right behind me, but it never came. After a short distance, I stopped with the realization that I would spend the rest of my life wondering if what I experienced was real or some kind of break from reality. So I resurfaced once more, without the flashlight. Everything was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. All except for two glowing red orbs in the distance. I couldn't make out anything else, not even the shape of the owner's head. They were completely still, until they suddenly rose several feet higher, like how a snake will stand straight up. It's hard to guess the height even at that angle, but at the very least, it was much taller than a human. Needless to say, it was a while before I went into another cave, and it certainly wasn't that one. When I was 6 or 7, whatever age you are in first grade, my mom married my stepdad, Abel, and their honeymoon was a 3-day vacation in Hawaii. My Uncle Pat and Aunt Marcy lived in a houseboat on Shasta Lake. They said that they would watch over me while they were gone. Thursday night, I'd be dropped off at the marina after school. Uncle Pat came out and helped me with my bags, wished my mom and Abel safe travels. Pat walked beside me with my backpack as I rolled my suitcase down a quiet dock. I remember the racket of its wheels against the metal grates. It was even louder than the distant waves. Feeling like I'd be bothering all of my uncle's neighbors, I picked up my suitcase and carried it the rest of the way. My uncle's boat was at the end of the dock. I began to notice that his boat was one of 3 or 4 sitting in the marina, all spread apart on their own corners. My uncle's boat was a large brown one with blue on the hull. From the deck, I walked down a small set of stairs to their living room. It was set up like a normal living room of a small apartment. Kitchen next to the couch, across from the TV, and a dwarf dining table near the front of the door. Past the living room was another door. It led to my uncle's bedroom. My bedroom was the couch of the living room I just described. Thursday into Friday was eventless. We had dinner, and then I fell asleep watching a VHS of Jurassic Park on their little TV. The next day, my uncle picked me up from school and told me that Marcy came down with bronchitis and that I should try to play on the deck most of the afternoon. So when we got back, I brought all of my Barbies and their accessories above deck, and I played with them up there. I'm sitting on the foam cushioned seats, playing with my dolls, fully enveloped in a storyline I've made up for them, when I hear the sound of running approaching from down the dock. A fog had rolled through that afternoon, so much of the dock that we were tied to was barely visible. Looking straight down, I couldn't see anything. I heard the running stop near the boat, but the person never came into view through the fog. The sound of running feet was unmistakable, so I leaned over the deck railing a little further and said, "Hello?" Still leaned out. I listened for anyone to call back, or steps retreating, but the eerie quietness remained, undisturbed. When turning my attention back to my Barbies, I couldn't help but notice that they lay in different positions now. The one I'd just sat down in front of my knees was now laying next to the other doll, across from me. I kept playing, but wasn't sure what had just happened. Later that night at dinner, Aunt Marcy stayed in the room with the door shut while Pat and I sat at the table and ate. I asked Uncle Pat if any other kids lived out here. He said no. That night, I think I was falling asleep to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The fuse pops and the TV shuts down, and the thick glass screen turns black. I stare at myself through its dark reflection. Then, a second figure appears in the reflection. It's standing behind the couch I'm laying on. There's a tabletop light on next to me, so the image I'm looking at is in vivid contrast. The scare literally jolts my body from the couch to the floor. I turn to look, but nothing was behind the couch, nothing outside the window. But the figure is still visible in the reflection of the TV. I'm rapidly looking back and forth from the TV to the couch, but I couldn't see anything that would make the strange reflection I'm seeing. I stare back into the black TV screen. My eyes are fixed on this black mass standing behind the couch. Then it ducks back down, disappearing from the reflection I'm staring at, and I absolutely lose it. I scream. My uncle comes running out. I tell him what just happened, and he only addresses the fuse part, asking if I smell any smoke or anything. I said no, I only heard the pop, and then the TV went black. That's when Uncle Pat walks around a little confused, wondering why none of the other electronics turned off. He picks up the remote from the armrest of the couch. He presses the power button. The TV lights up again, still playing Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The VHS never stopped. Pat's theory is that I accidentally bumped the remote and turned the TV off. I didn't protest his theory. Pat went back to bed, and I restarted the movie from the beginning, tried to fall asleep before the credits. I must have been successful because morning did indeed come. This would be my last day on the boat, really. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty ready for it to all be over. I did my best the next day to convince my uncle to spend time off the boat. It felt good to have distractions for a solid few hours. I kept the experience out of my mind long enough to enjoy some fair food, a couple of rides. Naturally, as the day started to come to a close, I grew more uneasy about falling asleep on the boathouse again. Lucky for me, my uncle stayed up most of that night, drinking, playing guitar. I didn't have time to get scared because he was playing music and trying to tell me stories I didn't really understand, quite frankly, which made falling asleep rather easy. As I got older, I kind of decided that I encountered a spirit, possibly a child. I didn't feel like it was trying to scare me, even though it completely did. It just felt curious. Maybe even that it wanted to play. I don't know. Uncle Pat doesn't remember anything, and certainly doesn't believe in ghosts. Marcy, on the other hand, I don't know. I think she knows something. She never wants to talk about it. Whenever I do, she's really quick to change the subject. Probably because they still have to live on that boat. I don't know. What do you guys think I encountered? For reasons that I'm sure will become obvious, the names in this story have been changed. My dad was a chef for a very wealthy family from 1972 through the summer of '81. He was one of 3 in-house chefs. They would each rotate staying in one of the guest rooms for a week to be on call for anything this family may request at any hour. During the summertime, they would pay my dad extra to accompany them on their yacht, continuing his duties as chef while they'd travel the northern Atlantic for weeks at a time. At the end of one of these trips, my dad returned home carrying a pillowcase. Being the nosy kid I was, I looked inside and saw more money than I'd ever seen in my life. That night, my dad tells my mom that he no longer works for the family, that we'd be moving to Cleveland the very next morning. That night, as my parents fought in the other room, I gathered my favorite things, trying to keep as much as possible. As I listened through the wall, I could tell it was serious. My mom was crying. My dad was crying. All night I watched as they packed as much as they could fit inside our suitcases. Everything else was left behind. I was too young to understand the gravity of what was happening around me. Too young to pack my own suitcase. We arrived at the airport some ungodly hour in the morning, landed in Cleveland also in the morning. For the first 2 months, all of us stayed in a small motel until my dad found us a house in Jefferson. The pillowcase stash of money was more than enough to support us while my dad found a new job. Though I was young, I knew this was a dark time. My parents asked me not to tell any of the kids where I'd come from. They didn't even want me to use my real last name. I was of the ask no questions age, went along with this for a good percentage of my life. Years later, I was looking through an old photo album when I saw a Polaroid of me and my dad standing on that family's yacht. I remember my mom took that picture before he left to wherever he was going that time. Then I was reminded of that striped pillowcase full of money my dad had brought home all those years ago. I took the Polaroid out of the sticky clear album page, brought it to my dad to ask about the family and the random sack of cash. He told me before I was born he worked in the kitchen of a pretty luxurious casino back where we originally came from. There he met one of the owners who enjoyed his culinary skills so much, he hired him as a personal chef. We'll call him Eddie. Eddie had multiple lines of revenue he'd pursue on top of his casino earnings. Some of his associates and people he considered his friends were a couple high-ranking members of the Latin Kings and an unnamed MC from a couple of states west. My dad said almost immediately after he took the gig, he was looking for ways out. He'd almost predicted that something bad was going to happen, but he could never make a clean exit. Unfortunately, and fortunately for him, Eddie liked him a lot, his cooking even more. On occasion, Eddie would host a poker night on his yacht, invite them and their families. Those big excursions, my dad had the 2 other cooks with him, but this trip was different. There was a small crew on board for what was supposed to be a 3-day trip down the South Atlantic. The guests Eddie was hosting were his brother Robert, whom my father had also become friends with over the years. He was a commercial fisherman and would drive the yacht, as well as a business partner named Wade, described as a small, nervous-looking man. My father smoked cigars with the men and wondered why he was on the boat that day. He'd only met Wade once before, when he'd attended a birthday party at Eddie's house. On their first night out at sea, Robert drops the anchor and they sit idle. My dad goes to the upper level to start the grill and prepare dinner for everyone. That's when he hears arguing from the men on the lower deck. The arguing gets louder. Sounds like it turns physical. Dad stares over the railing to the fight below. Wade's outnumbered by the brothers. He sees Robert restraining Wade's arms from behind. As Eddie punches the wind out of him, a left hook to the stomach sends Wade to the ground. My dad silently winces for Wade, only briefly closing his eyes. He opens them and he sees Robert pick Wade back up. Just enough time for him to scream, "Please don't," before Eddie shoots him at point-blank range. Immediately, my father closed his eyes, but couldn't bring himself to move. He could hear Robert and Eddie pull up the anchor, tie Wade's body directly to the metal slab, before they dragged it off the back of the boat. My father was sure he was going to be killed next. Instead, when they saw my father standing frozen on the upper deck, they insisted that he continue dinner as they cleaned up this mess. Their literal words. The 3 men shared a steak dinner that night in the yacht, idled by an anchor with Wade's body fastened tightly against it. Eddie remorsefully explains to my father that he and Robert had to do this. Wade had been trying to give tribal police some information on the casino, and it was rumored that Wade had made some less than favorable advances towards Eddie's teenage daughter. Unfortunately for Wade, Eddie had most of the tribal police department under his payroll, and he really loved his daughter. The officer called Eddie the moment Wade left his office. Robert thought that Wade would be too suspicious to get on the yacht if he didn't see my dad on board. They were both very apologetic for involving my dad, using him as a pawn of sorts. Without changing his sympathetic tone, Eddie says that he and Robert need to leave the country for a while, and that my dad and his family will have to leave the state. Eddie wasn't worried about my dad snitching. After all, he made it clear that he knew my family very well, where we lived, went to school, my parents' names. He assured my dad he could and would find us if necessary. On the boat before they docked, Eddie filled the pillowcase full of money from 2 safes inside the yacht. With an overly firm handshake, he wished my dad safe travels. My father looked for weeks. Nothing ever popped up about Wade. No missing persons. Nothing. It was sort of surreal listening to this story firsthand. With both my parents deceased now, it's definitely worth a retelling. I do marine salvage operations in the Pacific. Until recently, I never imagined doing anything else. Now I'm looking into any career that keeps me away from the ocean. I don't even like going to the beach anymore. A couple of months ago, we were contacted by a well-known company that wouldn't like being named, but you've definitely heard of them. In 2014, they lost contact with a ship that was only 8 days into its route. and it was never heard from again. Search and rescue teams made every effort to locate the missing vessel, but ultimately they had to accept the loss. This left a lot of families without closure and cost the company millions. But that was the end of it, until this year when the wreckage was discovered by chance. Once it was identified, we were hired. In this case, so much time had passed that any human remains would be long gone, and the cargo would be useless. This was mostly about closure and publicity. These companies hire people like us with the hope that we'll find something to exonerate them, though if they are to blame, they simply won't share the report. We spent the first day doing recon, hoping to see an obvious reason for why the ship sank, but we couldn't find anything wrong with her, except for the obvious damage caused by being submerged. But if they were attacked or taken by a sudden storm, there would be recognizable signs. On day 2, we entered the wreckage in search of the voyage data recorder, which is just a ship's version of the little black box. We found it exactly where it was supposed to be, and our techs were able to recover the data for the vessel's last 48 hours afloat. I've spent most of my life at sea. I've experienced things that will haunt me for the rest of my life, but this is the one that convinced me to retire. The box records all of the ship's instrument readings, along with audio recordings from the bridge. For whatever reason a ship might sink, there will be certain indicators from the instrument readings alone, but not this time. Everything was operating perfectly up until the ship's final seconds. The only abnormal findings came from the bridge recordings. They began with the captain asking a crewman if he was able to find the child. It didn't make any sense. No children were listed on the manifest, and they generally aren't found on cargo ships. After listening to the whole thing, we were even more confused, but we pieced it together as best we could. Needless to say, you won't be hearing about this in the news. The company decided to keep this information private. From what we can tell, a young girl, roughly 10 years old, was on board, but no one knew how she got there. They assumed she was a homeless stowaway due to her torn clothes and dirty appearance. But you could tell they didn't believe it. They sounded afraid of her. One crewman reported following a rotten smell to the cargo hold, where he heard a child crying. Thinking she didn't hear him, he tried to approach quietly in an attempt to corner her between containers. Only, when he got to the end of the row, nobody was there, and the crying stopped instantly. The only thing left where the child should have been was a small pot of black tar-like substance that was identified as the source of this rotten smell. There was also talk of a bad luck streak that coincided with the girl's appearance when the captain received news of another accident. One of the cooks severed the top of their finger at the knuckle while chopping veggies, swore that somebody had grabbed his hand. I expected this claim to be met with skepticism, but instead, it was compared to a crewman who broke his ankle while descending a ladder. He'd felt someone grab the back of his shirt and pull hard, causing him to fall backwards. His foot became trapped between the rungs. The problem with his story is that nobody else was around, and there was nowhere to hide in the small corridor. The ship's final day began with reports of another sighting. This time, the girl was seen roaming the corridors to the sleeping quarters. They reported dark, muddy water was pouring from her eyes and mouth like a faucet. But when additional men were sent back to investigate, everything was completely dry. The captain called for yet another full search of the ship. Every nook was methodically searched, but there was no evidence of the girl. It was like she snuck on board with nothing but the clothes on her back. Just hours later, a crewman reported that the cargo hold was ankle-deep underwater, but there were no signs of a hull breach. They weren't transporting any liquids. All of the instruments appeared to be operating perfectly. The crew was stumped. The water was rising quickly. Eventually, the captain was forced to give the orders to abandon ship. They had enough space in the lifeboats to carry double their numbers, and they had more than enough time to safely escape. But the lifeboats were gone. They'd been there the previous day, but in the morning's panic, no one realized they were missing until it was too late. They couldn't even call for help. Every attempt to use the radio was met with nothing but static. Ultimately, the crew waited on deck until the last second, when they were forced to take their chances in the open water. All except for the captain, who chose to go down with his ship. I think he fully understood how hopeless their chances were and preferred a quicker end. There's no telling how long the others survived or how much they suffered. The captain spoke once more before falling silent forever. In his final moments, he spoke of seeing the girl. She came to thank him for staying with her. She'd been lonely for a very long time, but they became friends. Any skeptics who hear that recording will probably blame a dying man's hallucinations, including me. That's because it's much better than the truth. It's better to tell yourself that and forget this whole story than to admit the soft voice of a child can be heard in the background. It's faint, but if you turn the volume up to max, it's there. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me tonight, whether it's your first time or you're a regular. Your support means the world over here. Thanks so much for listening. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night, and keep those eyes open just long enough to find those new deep sleep videos. And of course, double features are going to make their way back into our lives here very shortly. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Huge shout out to all of my patrons whom I appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon, patreon.com/thedarkesthour. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me. Amanda, thedarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.